So we got two big hitters, Ableton Live and FL Studio. Let's find out which one is right for you. So both Ableton Live and FL Studio have different editions ranging at different prices. Ableton offer 3 different editions, and they include the intro version, which comes in at £69, and the standard edition coming in at £319, and lastly the Big Daddy suite costing a whopping £539. Now Ableton actually do a 4th version as well called Ableton Lite. However, you can't purchase this. It's usually bundled with audio interfaces and a few MIDI keyboards, etc, etc. On the other hand, FL Studio actually offers 4 different editions. The entry-level Fruity edition starts at £76, and their most popular selling producer edition coming in at £153, the signature edition at £230, and lastly, their monstrous all plugins bundle, which costs £365 at the time of this video. Both companies offer student discount as well, so if you are a student, you can actually save quite a bit if you want to buy Ableton or FL Studio. Bear in mind, FL Studio only offers student discount on their signature bundle, whereas Ableton actually offers the student discount on both the standard edition and their suite as well. So opening up both doors side by side, we can see a huge difference. Ableton looks fairly minimalistic and everything is more or less on 2 pages, the session view and the arrangement view. Whereas on FL Studio, we have different tabs to actually open up separate windows like the mixer or the arrangement, which FL Studio calls playlist. And this whole opening up multiple windows can get a little bit crazy, especially if you're unorganized. So whatever DAW you plan on purchasing has obviously got some sort of learning curve. And I know it can be a bit daunting to beginners to learn any DAW. I mean, there's so many different things we can do in these DAWs, it's unbelievable. But after a little while, you find it much easier to navigate around the software of your choice. FL Studio's learning curve is actually pretty easy thanks to their intuitive piano roll and channel rack. Most beginners will feel comfortable jumping into FL Studio even if they don't know any music theory. More on that when we have a look at the piano roll. Ableton, on the other hand, is a little bit more difficult for beginners to pick up. Now, I am not saying don't get Ableton, okay? Because I know a lot of producers who started out on Ableton and they picked up the software with no issues at all. Again, it just goes back to putting in that hard work and learning your DAW. So which one of these softwares is easier to actually songwrite in? Well, FL Studio has a pattern-based workflow, so it's really easy to quickly create different sections of a track by using their sequencer. FL Sequencer is also called the channel rack, and it's super simple to use with a bunch of features right at your fingertips. You can send literally anything to the piano roll by just right-clicking on your sound and selecting piano roll. One thing that I did find a little bit tedious in FL Studio was locating the effects I used on a track. Every time I wanted to tweak some reverb or compression, I would have to open the mixer and then open the effects unit. Not really a huge deal breaker, but just something to bear in mind. Now, even though I see Ableton Live as a completely different beast to FL Studio, there are some similarities. Just hear me out. So as I mentioned, FL Studio uses this pattern-based workflow. Now in Ableton, we have the session view, which allows us to sketch out our musical ideas. If we sketch out horizontally, it's almost like we are creating a pattern in FL Studio. But Ableton actually takes this a few steps further. We can launch any individual clips at any given time to give us new inspiration and new ideas. And this is crazy, not only for production, but also for performing live as well. So overall, Ableton's workflow is pretty easy and straightforward. I love the simplicity of dragging and dropping our sounds and quickly applying EQ or reverb to our tracks without having to open up any other windows or anything like that to make adjustments. Ableton and FL Studio have really powerful arrangement views. Ableton has a more classical approach in regards to automating parameters, and we can actually see automation within the MIDI or audio clip itself, whereas FL Studio sort of detaches the automation and actually makes a whole new clip. Recording audio is definitely much easier and intuitive in Ableton Live compared to FL Studio. Ableton allows you to resample, freeze tracks, and so much more right on the spot. And not to mention, sampling is really easy in Ableton Live as well. I found that with FL Studio, there's too much time being taken up by opening and closing windows, as I mentioned before. But then again, this really depends on what genre you guys produce, and I am not knocking FL Studio. In fact, I actually own a copy of FL Studio, and it is my go-to go-to DAW to create trap and drill beats. And the reason for that is the piano roll. If there's one thing that FL Studio can never be beaten on, it's the piano roll. The ability to easily strum notes or to generate random melodies, all the way to being able to adjust panning and velocity with just a couple clicks is a godsend. FL Studio's piano roll also remembers your last note length too, which is really handy and allows us to quickly press any note length and continue on your pencil war. FL Studio also allows you to use instant chord stamps, slice dividing by rhythm and complex arpeggiations, all without leaving the piano roll. You guys cannot tell me that FL Studio's piano roll is not the best. Ableton, on the other hand, has had some serious upgrades to its piano roll for Ableton Live 11. We can now select the scales just like in FL Studio, and also the new addition of probability and chance makes things super interesting. And lastly, the big one, MPE support. Yes, Ableton Live 11 now allows for native MPE support. The big word there is native. If you don't know what MPE is, it's just basically MIDI that's been going to the gym and hitting those weights, and allows for a more realistic and expressive playing. And guys, if you are enjoying this content, make sure you hit that subscribe button, big thumbs up, comment down below, be much appreciated. Let's get back to the video. So let's talk a little bit about stock plugins. Now, both DAWs come with great VSTs just out of the box. Ableton Suite Edition comes with 17 software instruments, 59 audio effects and 15 MIDI effects. That is actually quite a lot of stuff, and I love how Ableton has a really clean look to its VSTs. They're easy on the eye and really inviting to new producers as well. Ableton also includes Max for Live in their Suite Edition. Max for Live allows us to create and also use community-made plugins. So if you have the Suite Edition, you can actually open up Max for Live, create your own VST and share it out to the rest of the Ableton community. Now that is pretty cool. FL Studio's All Plugin Edition comes with 102 instruments and effects, and they are just as powerful in their own way. Some of the VSTs in FL Studio may not be that inviting to beginners, but overall the package you are getting is really sweet. And remember, FL Studio comes with Grossbeat, and if you are into producing trap or drill music, it's a no-brainer. So what about sampling? Well, Ableton has a really fast workflow for sampling and warping. You don't really need to load anything up, and you can just quickly get to work just by double-clicking an audio file or putting it into a sampler. FL Studio's approach is a little bit different. They have powerful plugins such as SliceX, Edison and NewTime that are capable of achieving some really complex things. SliceX allows you to chop up the audio and send it to MIDI, Edison allows for in-depth audio manipulation, and NewTime is great for warping audio. Although I do think I prefer Ableton's way of warping, it just seems a little bit more easier to use. But overall, both DAWs are great for sampling. Mixing in FL Studio is pretty straightforward. You can do all of the basic stuff like send and return, submixes and more. I wish that FL Studio made it a little bit easier to route our MIDI and audio tracks to the mixer in a more efficient way. Yes, we can open up an audio file and press Command or Control L to link the sound to the mixer, but it's still a bit of a pain. Ableton flows a little bit smoother and is easier to maintain, but that doesn't mean Ableton is superior for mixing. Everyone has their own workflow and everyone likes to work in a completely different way. Now let's talk a little bit about hardware controllers for both DAWs. Ableton has a dedicated controller as well called a Push 2. It brings Ableton to your fingertips, allowing you to just have greater control of your DAW. Even though this is great, it does cost a fair amount, around £500 in the UK. Now, FL Studio is a little bit of a weird one because they do have a controller, but at the same time it's not officially branded by FL Studio themselves. However, they do have the AKAI FL Studio Fire, which is a collaboration between ImageLine and AKAI themselves. Now, the Studio Fire is nowhere near advanced as the Push 2, but it can still be used to improve your workflow. Not to mention, you also get a free copy of FL Studio Fruity Fire Edition with it, which is pretty cool, and all of that just for $119. So not bad at all. Now, one major thing FL Studio does that no other company actually does themselves, and they actually offer lifetime free updates. So that means if you bought FL Studio 20 today, you'll get all of their updates completely free, including their latest releases. So FL Studio 21, 22, 23, 24, so on and so on. So you only have to actually make a payment once. And I actually think that that is super cool of ImageLine to do that. I mean, with Ableton, even though I love Ableton so much, I still need to dig deep into the pockets to pay for those upgrades and new additions that come out. So let's actually have a quick roundup of the pros and cons of Ableton and FL Studio. So the pros of Ableton, well, firstly, it's really clean and easy to follow. You can also perform live with it as well. And also the sampling is really damn easy too. The addition of Max for Live is really good as well. I mean, if you guys are into sound designing or you want to experiment with that side, well, Ableton's actually got Max for Live, so you can have as much fun as you guys want. And lastly, I think that Ableton is actually more inviting to record in the arrangement view. Now, what are the cons of Ableton? I could only actually think of 3. The first one is that, well, it's slightly more expensive than FL Studio. The second one is internal routing. Now, I know that you can put submixes in groups, etc, but that's probably the most you can actually do with Ableton's routing. And lastly, the piano roll is still mediocre. I mean, even though Ableton 11 has introduced us to a whole bunch of new features, I still think it's lacking compared to FL Studio. Now, what are the pros and cons of FL Studio? Well, firstly, the pros: fast workflow, immensely good piano roll, cheaper than Ableton Live, and also those free updates for life. That is, again, still, that's just crazy. And lastly, the sequencer to MIDI conversion is really good as well. Now, what are the cons of FL Studio? Well, firstly, all those windows, it can become a cluster full of windows if you are not careful. And secondly, it's not intuitive enough for track-based recording. And lastly, the shortcuts in FL Studio are so confusing. There are so many shortcuts in FL Studio, it's unbelievable. One thing that really puzzles me though about FL Studio is the delete button doesn't actually delete anything. You have to right click, and that's a little bit weird, but I guess some people love that, some people don't. So what are my thoughts? Well, I use both of them. I use FL Studio for trap and drill, and I use Ableton for EDM and pop. And both DAWs are really powerful and they have their own individual workflow. And if you are still confused as to which one to purchase, don't worry. I'm gonna pop a link in the description down below where you can download the free trials for both Ableton Live and FL Studio 20. If you guys did like this video, give me a big thumbs up, comment down below, and smash that subscribe button for more videos just like this. I'll see you guys in the next one.